Nanadef Anis,
Mangi.
thank you so much for accepting our invitation for this interview.
My pleasure.
So, welcome everyone in this new interview of 30 Minutes With. 30 Minutes With is a series of interviews with African policymakers, leaders, researchers on African current affairs. So today we are very delighted to welcome here in Senegal Anis Moussime, whom, as you see, have now picked some Wolof words and is fully fluent in Wolof. And today's interview will be about African women's leadership. So Eunice, you are the CEO of Akina Mama Africa. Can you tell us about this organization that you're leading and what are its main objectives?
Thank you. It's my honor and pleasure to be on 30 Minutes. My name is Eunice Moussime. I am the Executive Director of Akina Mama Africa. This year in 2025, Akina Mama Africa will be celebrating 40 years of existence. We're very excited. It's such a momentous moment. So Akina Mama Africa is an organization that was set up by African women who lived in the diaspora. Their tag word then was speaking for ourselves. At the time, African women who lived in the UK faced many challenges, and while the challenges may have changed, they're still the same. So challenges with their sexual and reproductive health rights, challenges with their economic rights, as you can imagine at that time in 1985, issues of decent work were real, and challenges with their leadership. So Akina Mama exists to advance gender and social justice, while currently now we focus on economic justice and climate action, women's political leadership, and sexual and reproductive health rights. We also recognize that we are intersectional feminists, and so whatever issue that touches the life of an African woman and an African girl concerns us, and we seek to deconstruct all systems of oppression and construct systems where women, girls can thrive, can have justice, can live in a fairer world.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for this brilliant introduction of your organization. Akina Mama Africa, is it Swahili? What does it mean?
Solidarity for African women.
Solidarity for African women. So at this critical juncture, Beijing plus 30, I think this was the context of the setting up of Akina Mama Africa. 30 years later, what is your retrospective analysis of the actions that you have taken forward, the projects and programs that you have, and how do they contribute to the situation of African feminists on the continent?
Thank you so much. As we commemorate 30 years of the Beijing Platform for Action, one is to really recognize that at the time it was a visionary document that really sought to improve the status of women in all their diversities. The 12 critical areas that it covered were really critical at that time. And in retrospective, we celebrate that it really sought to uplift the status of women and girls. And 30 years later, we've made progress. There are accomplishments. If you look at how many women have been able to take up leadership positions or be part of decision-making spaces, we can celebrate that. Over 25% of African women are members of parliament. We can also celebrate the percentages of women that are in the executive. We can also celebrate the reduction of, for example, maternal mortality, issues to do with access to jobs for women and girls. So there are lots of things that we can celebrate 30 years later. But it's also critical at this juncture to say that while there's been progress, it has been painstakingly very slow, and it's causing a level of frustration. The effort with which African women put into this work is not matched by the progress. So that remains a pain point. And also, of course, the world has changed 30 years later. So there are emerging issues that need to be addressed. For example, when you think about gender-based violence, digital or cyberbullying, all those are issues that were not as much a problem then 30 years. And so now this is something that we really need to address. When you think about issues to do with climate change, 30 years ago we were not in the same level of crisis that we are in right now. So that's something. When we think about the progress, we cannot not speak about the fact that the anti-gender and the anti-rights movement has gained ground 30 years later. So all those are emerging issues that we truly need to be able to address. So that creates concerns for us to see that the gains we had, we've not been able to safeguard some of them. So we've seen the retrogression in those areas that we had made progress. So the mantra of 10 steps forward and 20 backwards rings true at such a time, and it's disheartening.
Thank you so much for this assessment, very realistic assessment of the situation right now for African women and girls' rights. Can you tell us about the challenges that you at Akina Mama Africa are facing to organize in a Pan-African way? Because that was the main goal of Akina Mama Africa. How easy or how challenging is it right now to organize with a Pan-Africanist view?
So I would say one of the major challenges is that we still face a lot of resistance to advancing gender and social justice across the continent. So that remains a major challenge. We've seen that, for example, when African governments are discussing different protocols or different themes as they do each year, issues of gender are trivialized. For example, we're at a meeting where we're discussing the progress of the Beijing Plus 30, and you'd find that African governments are opposing certain language to be included in the documents for several reasons. So
mostly political.
Yes, mostly political. So yes, there are all those, the resistance to gender justice or the resistance to promotion of women's rights. We see, for example, our gender machineries in all the countries have been stripped of resources, and therefore they are not able to do much work. And that's not to say that there isn't progress, but to say that the resistance is enormous, and that negative cultural norms remain deeply entrenched. And so that also becomes a problem. When you think about, for example, recently when the Gambia was trying to overturn the law on FGM, female genital mutilation, that tells you at what level we are at in terms of resistance across the African continent. So yes, the retrogression, we've not been able to safeguard some of the gains, but then also the backlash has come in quite strongly, and then conservatism is gaining ground. So the far-right movement has done a good job in terms of convincing different national governments, but even continentally, that we need to promote family values. And so that then creates a problem for African women and girls who do identify differently. So those are some of the issues that I would say. I would also add that the political environment has also become extremely tense. Many feminists are organizing in spaces that are repressed or closed. And so with a political crisis in place, for example, when we think about the Sahel region, it's very hard for any work to be done in such a situation. So all those are challenges because we cannot separate women's rights from the environment. We cannot separate it from issues to do with democratic backslides. Yeah.
Thank you, Eunice. I think you have very aptly described the situation that some people have called a polycrisis. So both political crisis, which leads to a lot of internally displaced populations, climate change, which is also leading to climate-induced displacement. You have also talked about the economy. I think it's the missing link we often tend to make, because women and girls are the most affected populations when we have the right of conservatism or austerity. I think even women who are at these cross-border regions in the Sahel, the region you just mentioned, are not also able to continue to pursue their activities as they do normally. So this is a very bleak, to say the least, very bleak landscape that we are facing and we are trying to navigate. And women's political leadership is very crucial in addressing the root causes of all these evils. And this is a central point of your work, both academic but also the work you're doing with Akina Mono Africa. Can you tell us about why this topic is so dear to your heart, and what key challenges you are seeing for women, in particular African women and girls, to be recognized as leaders?
Thank you so much for that setting of the scene. We know that for the longest time, African women and girls have not been part of decision making for those decisions that impact and affect their lives. So it's important that as we think about everything else that we'd like to promote on women's rights, to also think about women's political rights, and also to think about ensuring that women are part and parcel of making the decisions that affect their lives. There's a different lens that women bring to decision making that is often overlooked by others. When we look back at the COVID crisis, there was a lot of examples across the globe that showed that women leaders were able to put into consideration other issues that others would not think about, would not consider. So there's a case to be made for women being part of decision making. But to start off by saying it's also a right. It's a right for women to be part of decision making, but it's also important and it's critical. But when we look across the continent, women continue to be excluded from making decisions. Even when women have made it in terms of representation, that hasn't translated into substantive representation. So women's influence in spaces of decision making remains limited, and that's something that we need to work on. So it's been said that beyond the numbers, we really need to work on seeing that we have women who are in those spaces of decision making that are going to take critical decisions that are going to affect the lives of other women.
So we are here in Senegal. We've seen the example of how quota laws, positive affirmative action, how they call it, have brought about positive outcomes. We've seen also in Rwanda that has also been the case. It has been linked to political, to the situation, the post-genocide situation, of course. Are you convinced by these quota laws and what they can achieve? Or do you think that for them to be effective, they need to be accompanied by other measures?
So there's definitely no silver bullet. But I still believe and I'm convinced that quotas are still important because it's important for us to address the historical injustice of women's underrepresentation in decision making. So quotas is just but one way of doing that. Of course, we've gone ahead to ask for 50-50, so gender parity, so going beyond the 30% in terms of affirmative action. But I would like to say that even when women rights advocates were calling for 30%, it was out of the recognition that there was need for a critical mass of women in those spaces that would be able to change the tides. And I know, I'll give an example. In Uganda, you'll find a young woman who is aspiring for leadership and is able to say that because Uganda had a female speaker, I am able to aspire for leadership. So it's still important to have
the role model effect.
Yes, the role model effect. That's still important because you grow up watching television and you're seeing no women. So what would give you the motive or the inspiration to dream that you can also be part of decision making? So quotas are still important, but they are not enough. So yes, while we've gotten women in spaces of decision making, we've not been able to transform the political culture or put in place an enabling environment for women to be effective in those spaces. So it's important that for us that we continue to address the systemic and the structural barriers that women face in spaces of leadership and decision making, which would enable women to be able to be more effective. So beyond the quotas, there are issues to do with media, there are issues to do with weak political parties that are not enabling women to be able to exercise power in ways that they would rather exercise power. So there are a number of other issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think it is a very crucial point that you're making, that despite the individual measures that can be put in place, we need to address the structural issues that still hinder women from accessing and really playing their role and be part and parcel of democracy. So you are here in Senegal as well to visit one of your partners and in relation to one of your projects on political dialogue. Can you tell us more about that aspect of the work of Akina Mamawa Africa?
Yes, so for the last 5 years, with support from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we've been implementing a project that we call the Power of Dialogue, which primarily seeks to ensure that women and youth, political and civic actors are able to become influential agents of change. And we're doing this through different ways, through capacity building or leadership building, through creating spaces to reflect on issues like we've talked about, the hurdles that women and youth face. So when we speak about the fact that youth face enormous hurdles in decision making, it's even a double bind for young women. So the young women, yes, they face the challenge of being a young person, but they also face the challenge of being a woman. So it's a double bind. So really reflecting on how we can address such issues. We've also been reflecting on the enabling environment, so issues to do with democracy. What does that mean? We've seen young people begin to question whether democracy is delivering better outcomes for Africans. But we also know that there are also a number of Africans who still believe that democracy is important, but we've not given it an opportunity to grow into the sort of democracy that does not remain at legal and policy frameworks or ticking the box of holding elections that does not translate into the improvement of the livelihoods of African women. and men as well. So
And that's what I wanted to ask you next. That's a beautiful transition. What is the role of men in this sharing of power and in creating this enabling environment? Here in Senegal, there has been a concept called positive masculinity that has been promoted in some political instances, spheres. What do you think about that?
So we are here on this earth with both men and women. And we know that right now it's the men who hold political power. So it's obviously important for us to engage them as gatekeepers, but as power holders, as decision makers, if we would want to see that tide change. But it's also important to recognize that it's not a binary of men versus women. It's really seeking to address the structural and systemic issues that are creating barriers for women and girls. So we shouldn't individualize it, but to really look at what can we do that will deconstruct systems of power. So patriarchy, capitalism, neoliberalism, that is holding us back. So it's also important that we do that. And I do appreciate the angle of positive masculinity, because we've seen, when we think about what's happening across the continent, it's patriarchal leadership playing out in different ways. There are militaristic approaches that are taken by both men and women. So being able to address some of those issues would definitely create some change.
Thank you so much, Eunice. I think that's a very important point. And also going beyond the binary as intersectional feminists, I think is very crucial. Recognizing the damages that heteropatriarchy as well has created. So what are your views on conflict on the continent? We're talking about political leadership. We cannot not mention what's happening in the DRC right now for women and girls, what is happening in South Sudan, in Sudan as well. 2 years after the start of the war in Sudan, we've seen many women and girls who have been victims of rape, of sexual violence, of abuse. But even beyond that, I think the international headlines, we're seeing what's happening in Palestine, Gaza. What, at this critical juncture, can revisiting that Beijing plus 30 agenda can allow us, but also revisiting the agendas that we have from the African Union, Agenda 2063, Agenda 2030 of the UN. What can that allow us to attain?
So one of the anniversaries that we shall be celebrating this year is also the anniversary of 1325, which is focusing on increasing women's leadership in terms of women, peace and security. Yeah, so that also remains a critical point of reflection to ask ourselves, to what extent has that also been implemented? So when we think about all the legal and policy frameworks, we've been great at coming up with all these instruments or setting up normative frameworks, but we haven't done very well in terms of implementation. And that's really the missing link. That's where we need to move towards. I know 30 years later, you'd hope that we have solved that issue of implementation, but we haven't. So right now we are speaking about what areas do we need to accelerate in terms of women's rights, in terms of women, peace and security, in terms of resolving all the conflicts on this continent that are not necessarily in totality caused by internal forces, because we also know there's another hand at play that is also fueling and instigating some of these conflicts. So as decolonial feminists, we also really need to be critical of that aspect of the conflicts on the continent, because at some point conflicts were coming to an end. The African Union had come up with a theme of silencing the guns by 2020. So we had really hoped that would silence the guns and move on to more serious business of economic development for Africa. But it's such a pity that we are back in a series of conflicts across the continent. And while we also look at active crises or conflicts, we also know that even for countries that are not at war, there's high tensions in those. I mean, Kenya is not at war, but when you think about it, yes, when you think about the countries that are going to be having elections this year, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda next year, a number of countries. So it's like elections also bring on another cycle of violence. So all those are issues to bring to the fore, to discuss, that keep us awake at night as African feminists.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for taking the time to share these answers. I think the last question that I will ask you is the message that you have for young African feminists who want to engage in, who want to become political leaders. What would your advice to them be?
I would say that to the young African women leaders, that the future and the present is in our hands. It's we have to play an active role in shaping the sort of societies that we would want to see for all of us. So we are so inspired by young people, because a lot of times we think that it's the older generation that's inspiring us. But when you think about the Gen Z revolution, there was a lot of inspiration that we picked, even as middle-aged feminists. So I would say for where we've done well, please take it forward. For where we have failed, we apologize. Forgive us, and you can do better.
Yes, and on this note, I would also add, we don't want to be part of any revolution if we cannot dance. So I think we have to keep that feminist fire burning, and also having joy at the center of our preoccupations, because it's already difficult, it seems, to be a feminist on the continent. So I think these type of gatherings, conversations that we are having here in Senegal today are crucial. Transnational dialogues rooted in sisterhood. So thank you so much for your time, for your generosity. And do you have a last message for those who are following us from everywhere on the African continent and in the diaspora?
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me on these 30 minutes. It's been a pleasure and honor. For me, I think this demonstrates the value of conversations. We need to have more and more conversations to reflect, to share ideas, to bring inspiration from different spaces and actors. Being in Senegal, I think visiting the Gorée Island can be quite depressing, thinking about slavery. But then also visiting the Monument of African Renaissance then provides the hope. So in times like this, we are able to draw from our history and ask ourselves what are the lessons that we learn from there, but then also look at the future with hope.
Thank you so much for this hopeful note to end on. Eunice, it would be a pleasure to welcome you next time and to conduct the interview in French.
Bonjour.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Thank you so much to our followers. It was a pleasure welcoming you in this new interview of 30 Minutes with Eunice Musibe of Akinamamo Africa. Thank you.